Oh, wait, actually, no, wait.
I'll text it to you in the chat here. Don't worry about it.
Okay, cool. Yeah, because it just sent me to your, oh, wait, here we go. Here it is. Awesome. Uh-oh. Wait, this is all going live, so.
We're all live now.
There we go.
This is sort of like the, what do they call it? The stuff that doesn't make the editing room.
This is DVD extras.
DVD extras, right. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is Christoper Knowles, the Secret Son, and he's here today joining us. And it's really a great pleasure and opportunity to hang out with you and travel into the vast cosmos, which is right behind your head back there. So welcome to the show. This is the Friday FARcast. I'm Robert Phoenix. How are you? How are you doing?
I'm doing great.
Yeah.
Doing real good.
Good. So one of the things I like to do is I like to start the interview off by asking really basic questions like, who are you? Where did you come from? And how did you get here? Right. So why don't we start there? And I know we're going to get into your history as an author. You've got some books, and I'm going to put them up on the screen so people can see them. So we'll cover all that stuff as well. But let's go personal here for a second, and let's dive into your past.
Okay. What do you want to know?
All right. So who are you? How did you get here? Like, how did Christoper Knowles become Christoper Knowles? I think that's a really good place to start.
Well, born and bred in Boston, Massachusetts, specifically Braintree, Massachusetts. Grew up in a family of professional musicians. My mother was a professional musician, spent a lot of time in nightclubs and concert halls and things like that. Got exposed to a lot of unsavory elements from a very early age. Grew up in a place and time that was extremely strange and weird, and a town that is kind of like a real life Twin Peaks or a real life Lumberton, or at least was. I'm sure like gentrification has kind of knocked that out, but it was very much a town that was run by all the various organized crime interests in the area. Whitey Bulger, for instance, Winter Hill Gang, the Archdiocese of Boston.
They were running everything. I mean, I've seen these interviews on Vlad TV, and he has these gangsters, like he likes gangsters. And so he has people on there that talk about the connection between that area of Massachusetts and New York. And they were running stuff, everything, if it was numbers, girls, nightclubs, bars, garbage trucks, they were running everything. And then the New York guys got interested and said, there's something going on over here. We want in on this. And I don't think people understand just how pervasive the mob was in the Massachusetts area.
No, I mean, basically the state was run by the Bulger brothers. William Bulger was the Speaker of the House, and his brother ran, basically the underground economy. So you had the government and the underground economy run by these two brothers from South Boston. Whitey Bulger was notorious MK Ultra graduate, was experimented on at Alcatraz, sort of like a star pupil for the program. And it just goes to show you, how deep the rot goes. But I wrote a book called The Endless American Midnight, which is a collection of writings with new writings, but a lot of it I talk about, where I grew up. And I don't just give you anecdotes, you supply the clippings, the evidence to show just how completely screwed up this town was. Whoa. Oh, there you go. I was like, where did he go? So the Archdiocese of Boston is located. They had to sell their big fancy cathedral to pay for all the settlements. But the guy who was basically bankrolling the diocese was a guy named Flatley, who owned most of Braintree, and deeded land to the Archdiocese when they were bankrupted by all the settlements. Yeah, I mean, I go into this. It was a very strange time, and
so let me
a
ask
lot of organized crime. I mean, even to this day, I mean, you know, when I'd written in the book, up until the year 2016, there was this massive scandal, this evidence locker scandal at the Braintree Police Department that was like straight out of Serpico. And then, you know, the woman who was allegedly running it, who was in my homeroom in high school, was suicided basically. And yeah, and it's just a lot of human trafficking because there are a lot of hotels. It's sort of like a hub between Braintree and, I mean, between Boston and southern New England, you know, 95 down in New York. So there's a lot of traffic going in and out, and there's a lot of prostitution. The hotels always has been.
Right.
So, you know, I just sort of grew up in this milieu of like, nothing is what it seems. Nobody who is they appear to be. You know, one of the things I write about is that there was like an open pedophile pimp working out of my junior high school, middle school. He was at it for 22 years before they finally arrested him. They arrested him.
Was he involved in sports? Was he a coach?
He was he was a Boy Scout troop leader, and he was a foster parent, and I think a church group leader. I mean, up and down the line, everybody knew about it.
By the way, those are the real Satanists, not the ones that play dress up.
Yes,
right?
Yes, exactly. So, I mean, everybody knew about this in school. And like the first day of school, when I went to that school, my sister said, stay away from this guy. And it was so blatant and out in the open, and that it was clear that he was being protected. And it was clear that, I mean, he had a lot of money. You know, he had like all these kids that, you know, he was fostering, quote unquote. And they always had like the best mini bikes and the best sneakers. And, you know, he just really hooked them up with all the best stuff. And he was arrested. When he was finally arrested, he was arrested on a 52-foot yacht off the coast of Florida. So, I mean, it just goes to show you that, you know, I mean, this is the milieu I grew up in. Just a lot of violence.
How old were you when you became aware of this kind of unsettling nature and this false reality?
Pretty young.
And what did you do? What did you do with it? I mean, did you talk to your parents? I mean, where did you go with this understanding? Right, I know.
You know, I went into the hardcore clubs of Boston, Massachusetts. You know, I mean, I was kind of a mainstay on the first wave hardcore scene in Boston. You know, and I went to school with all those guys. You know, a lot of the groups that people still talk about from that scene, I went to. You know, I was in like middle school with. You know, and so I hung around that scene, and I saw a lot of things there too. You know, it just made me realize that the entire kind of entertainment industry is completely compromised from top to bottom, particularly the music industry. I mean, it's something I really understood from a very early age, because one of the clubs my mother had a residency at was owned by I don't think it was the Winter Hill Gang, but it was one of the Irish gangs out of Southie. And of course, you know, it was burnt down in an arson fire, because why wouldn't it be? So, you know, it was just very, very much a part of my history. And there's a lot of other stuff that I kind of go into and allude to, but yeah, it was messed up. It was really messed up. So from the beginning, you know, from my earliest age, I just had this understanding that, you know, the official story cannot be trusted.
Right.
That it's usually a lie. You know? Right.
So were you, I'm assuming, but it's not always good to assume, that that's a heavy Catholic area. Were you raised Catholic?
No, I was, well, see, that's the other interesting thing too, is that it was a very heavy Catholic area, but I was a Methodist.
Interesting.
My family was Methodist. And
so you're an outsider even in that world, right?
Yes. Yeah. So it gave me an interesting vantage point. You know, we were Methodists. We were very serious Methodists. You know, church was like dawn to dusk kind of deal. It wasn't just like, you know, I'd go to mass with my Catholic friends and it'd be like 20 minutes in and out, you know, and then all the men would go to the bars and all the women would go to the Dunkin' Donuts. So it was a different experience. So it was like very immersive religious experience for me. And I was also sick a lot, and I spent a lot of time in the hospitals in the area. Yeah, so I just had a very almost like, tempted to say like ghost-like kind of relationship to my environment. I was always just sort of on the margins for one reason or another. But I had a lot of fun in high school, so I'm not complaining.
Right. That's usually what high school winds up being for some people. For other people, it seems, and more so now, it seems to be really more alienating than ever, more disaffecting than ever, that whole experience. But back in the day,
that's social media.
Yeah.
I don't know how familiar you are with my work, but I'd written a series called Lucifer's Technologies that talked a lot about the ritualism behind the creation of the transistor and the microchips and everything, and how all these creations and inventions were always presaged or accompanied by high ritualism.
Right.
And I think that has been baked in, and we see that. I mean, we see, what I say all the time, and people think I'm just kind of kidding, is like, MK Ultra is like everywhere now. It's not some historical program that was shut down in the 70s, whatever. I mean, it's like, I don't know what they're calling it. There's probably a bunch of different names, but the precepts, the ideas behind all these programs, Artichoke, Bluebird, Naomi, often, all these programs, if you understand that the thinking behind them and the specific methodologies, you understand that this stuff is everywhere now. That was not about creating Manchurian candidates. It was about mass scale social transformation.
Mass scale social change. Yeah, absolutely. So they've streamlined it. They've figured out, they R&D'd it. They streamlined it. And now they have 1 million channels to broadcast the programming through. So when you got into the transistor age, I'm assuming that you're connecting that to the birth of rock and roll in the late 50s and the early 60s, because those two things seem to be really like kludged together, like, and you have the rise of the transistor radio and miniaturization and people walking around with these things up to their ears, right? The little black box.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, that was a little later. What I started with was the period after the war, and in some cases
World War II you're referring to, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
The Trinity tests.
Yeah.
And then a number of like quote unquote scientific experiments that are heavily laden with ritualism. So, having a very serious religious background, I understand ritual. I understand the thinking behind it, and you can just see it. So we had the Trinity tests, obviously, and then we also had Operation Crossroads. I don't know how many people are familiar with that, but those were the tests in the South Pacific, the H-bomb tests. Now, I mean, just think about like the terminology there, Operation Crossroads. Traditionally, what were crossroads?
That's where Robert Johnson went.
Yeah, I mean, it's, where you meet the demons and start making deals. And then there was also Project Diana, which coincided with the Babylon working. And I think that Hubbard and Parsons chose that period of time intentionally, because Hubbard had this huge obsession with Diana, right? Dianetics, right?
Right.
And then there was the Shelter Island Conference. And then there's all this, symbolism connected to Wells, Ra's well, right? The Rose well, that
Orson Welles, H.G. Wells.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
So, the symbolism is obsessive. And when you start to look at the specific details and trace some of the stories behind it, you start to realize that, these technologies and maybe not what they appear to be. Maybe there's something else going on. There's some other influence. I have a very supernaturalistic worldview. So I see this as, a function of the supernatural and the spirit realm contact. And I think a lot of I think a lot of people who aren't involved in creative fields don't understand how, for lack of a better term, supernatural creativity can be. I mean, you're tapping into, whether it's tapping into parts of your brain, your unconscious, or something else out there. It's a process that, to me, seems much more spirit-based than a reductive kind of just
If anybody's ever spent any serious time, playing around, creating, you'll usually tap into a moment where it's like a window opens. This window opens, and then something else seems to be participating with you in that moment, right?
That's true.
Yeah. And then you think about, well, what just happened? It was more than the sum of my usual parts. And how did I get here? And more importantly, how can I do it again?
Yes.
Right. That's what comes up.
Yeah. Well, I used to play guitar in bands and stuff, and I would just have out of body experiences while playing, and just I record these things and just be like, did I play that? Like, you have these experiences where you're looking at your hands do these things that you don't necessarily recognize.
Right.
Like I wouldn't play it that way. You know what I mean? It's like, what's going on here?
Right. Yeah.
You know what I mean? And that's, the ancients call that like the muses. I mean, there was always the idea of some other force working through you when you're inspired. And this is, this is universal across any number of religious traditions, from, the esoteric to the esoteric.
Right. In terms of that, some people can handle, be like the Holy Spirit, right? I mean,
exactly. Yeah, exactly. The Paraclete, the, speaking in tongues and everything like that, Pentecost.
Right.
That's something that, we learned about in church, and, and it's something that I don't think is unique to the Christian tradition. And scientists try to get all reductionist about it, but I don't think that really flies. I mean, you can explain what is happening, but you can't explain why it is happening or how it is happening.
Yeah.
Essentially. Yeah. Essentially, in my estimation.
Yeah, it kind of gets into that William James sort of classification of the mystical experience, right? There's the ineffable, which is an important part of describing the mystical experience. It's ineffable. You can't really reduce it for better or worse.
Yeah. And that's, I mean, I sort of see myself as a mystic, synchromystic, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm really at the point right now where it's just like, I don't try to label experience. I don't try to explain it. I don't try to impose some sort of quasi pseudoscientific rationale on it. I don't try to give it like these anthropomorphic identities, say like what a pagan might do, it's just about pure experience for me.
Right.
And I find that very liberating, because you disattach yourself from strictures that precede your birth and are, laden with all this cultural baggage and so on. And to me, it's just about pure experience now. I don't try to name things or codify them or explain them. It's just like, it's kind of like having sex, like when you're having sex, you want to surrender yourself to the experience. You don't want to try to, impose some narrative
map it out and break it down. Yeah.
So, it's, I think at that point in time, it took me a long time to get to, but, at that point in time, I think you experience true joy. You experience true joy when you're not trying to impose any sort of narrative.
Right. Meaning or order.
Yeah.
In a particular way. So how long did it take you to get there?
Oh, let's see, how old am I now? I'm 56. Yeah. I don't know, 55 years. Maybe.
So this is a recent development in your life.
No, well, see, I had kind of a medical crisis for a number of years. Well, my whole life has kind of been like a medical crisis, but you know, things started getting like kind of serious. I guess around the time I turned 40 or so. You know, I have a pain condition that was I used to treat naturally. You know, like I did martial arts and weights and stuff, and with diet, you know, eliminating certain things from my diet and everything. But then it's just got really, really bad, really out of control. And so I just ended up on the pharmaceutical train to hell. And that train makes a lot of stops. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. So the organic method works, but you really have to work it, right? You have to be assiduous. You have to take any number of supplements. You can't really, you know, fall off the wagon. Then you go the modern route and it's like easy, right? It's quick. It's this. You don't really have to check in and do all that heavy lifting in order to keep yourself well. But then there's a price to pay for that.
Oh, it's a terrible price to pay for that.
Yeah.
You know, so that lasted, you know, that whole experience lasted, you know, almost 15 years, I guess you would say, a little less, maybe 13 years. But, you know, it all came to a crashing halt, and I had to withdraw from a number of different pharmaceuticals that are notorious for being difficult to withdraw from. And, you know, it was a really tough time in my life, but, you know, I came out of the other end. And
so you had a Jordan Peterson moment. Is that what happened there?
I don't know about a Jordan Peterson moment, but
he was addicted to benzos and he had to get off of them.
Yeah. If I told you, if I read off the list of the medications and the dosages this friggin' quack had me on. See, the problem was that, you know, the pain just started getting worse and worse. And I didn't realize that it was the medications that was making the pain worse.
Right.
You know?
So here's the $64,000 question. Do you feel like you were targeted during that time through that specific quack by any chance?
Like individually targeted?
Yeah, like let's pump this guy up to the point where, you know, he's a lifelong customer and he's a kind of a vegetal remain of his former self.
I don't think I don't see myself as being targeted individually. I think, you know, it was
systemic.
It was systemic. It was a widespread program that started in the late 90s and was really just about getting people on the hook with these very toxic medications and so on. So anyway, I mean, that really, you know, from a very early age, I always had like, you know, a very mystical consciousness. Just, you know, I'd go out and experience nature, you know, by myself, you know, through every climatic, you know, condition, you know, snow, rain, heat, you know, night, day. And I always just felt like super connected to it. And it's something that, you know, you can't explain because it's almost like your brain is just firing on so many cylinders and there's so many associations and, you know, it's just like, but it's like that experience of being in nature that was, you know, kind of inborn with me, but the drugs just totally wiped it out.
Yeah.
You know, it just, they totally deadened me and, you know, and the pain and everything. So, getting away from that was kind of like, you know, finding myself on the other side. It's like, to me, like every day of my life is gravy now.
Right. Because you face something very intense and then you were able to transform that experience to where you
are now. I do. But it's also like, you know, my kids are all grown now. And, you know, I sort of had a career that ran like a natural lifespan. And I just really feel right now that like, this is just extra innings. Yeah, and that's what I'm saying. Like I feel like, you know, my life as it's understood, as it used to be understood, right? As it used to be understood as the American dream or whatever, or just like you get married, you have kids, you have a career, you buy a house. I mean, all that kind of stuff. I did all that kind of stuff. And so now, like I said, it's like, this is just the DVD extras of my life now, and I'm really enjoying it.
That's great.
So.
Let me throw another one of your books up here. This is where I checked into you.
All right.
I think you had just finished this book, and I was on Facebook at that time, and I think you were on Facebook too. And I think I connected in with you, not personally, but your work through this book.
Mm-hmm.
And it triggered a lot of really interesting things for me, because I was a big comic book guy growing up. And then I sort of dropped it when I was around maybe 15 years old, or even before that.
The normal, that's what normal people used to do.
Yeah, right. It's like, I'm done. Saturday morning cartoons, I'm done. I'm moving on. Right. So let's talk a little bit about this book and this idea of myths and archetypes and heroes. And I believe you were an illustrator too. Is that correct?
Yeah, I freelanced for Marvel for about 25 years. So
who are your favorite illustrators from Marvel?
Oh, from Marvel specifically?
Yeah, from Marvel specifically.
Well, Jack Kirby.
Jack Kirby's the man, right?
Yeah, Jack Kirby, John Byrne. The stuff that Miller did for Marvel. Gil Kane, Gene Colan, John Buscema. I mean, all the
that was the golden age of these illustrators, right?
Yeah, it really was. I was a little, I'm a Gen Xer, so it's like the whole silver age was kind of over by the time I learned how to read. I did learn how to read very early. I mean, I learned how to read when I was 3, using a comic book, by the way. But the Bronze Age, I guess, was sort of the hangover, but there was still a lot of great stuff going on. And, it was just really exciting. And, it was really exciting up until the mid 80s. And, you signed off when you turned 15. I kind of signed off when I turned 20, because after Watchmen and Dark Knight, I was just like, well, what else needs to be said? What else needs to be said? I pretty much just dipped out of superhero comics at that point in time. I still was reading a lot of comics, but they were, more alternative kind of things. And, but I started freelancing for Marvel when they were Toy Biz, and I did a lot of toy packaging. And it's like 95, I guess. So I guess I was 28, 29. And then, it just kind of went from there. And then, we had the whole superhero explosion. And, what Our Gods Wear Spandex really did is that it just kind of was like, it wasn't prophecy. It was just like telling people, like, this is what's coming for us. You know what I mean? Like,
right.
This is what the culture is going to be. And this, I wrote the book in 2006. So it was before the Iron Man movie and the Dark Knight, which really kicked off.
Changed everything.
Yeah, it changed, because before that we had the X-Men movies and we had the Spider-Man movies and stuff. And I think there was at least one of the Fantastic Four movies, I think. But it really wasn't anywhere on the level that it came to be. And I have to tell you, I mean, I think that I don't think it did the culture any favors. I think the immersion into geek culture was a net negative for culture and adulthood and humanity.
Well, then you throw in the rise of the cell phone too, right around the same time, right?
Yeah,
like the iPhone comes out strong in 2007, right? The iPhone 1. And it does things that other phones just can't do at that time. And it creates this access and this ubiquity to information that wasn't there before. If you were going to get on the internet, you had to have a computer, you had to have a little bit of savvy to play around and, find things. And not everybody had computers. Now, once you had the cell phone, it was like a plague at that point. So, so you have the rise of the cell phone right around the same time these comics are starting to become popularized, which I think accelerates the process you're talking about.
Well, it's funny you should mention all that, because really I had done a series on 1983, and I called 1983 the year that broke reality. And the reason being is that that's, the introduction of TCP/IP protocols, which is basically the internet. This is where you go from like the real internet,
right?
Before we had like BBs and stuff and dial-in. But the first cell phone was introduced in 1983. The Macintosh computer, which started the whole user-friendly movement. That
Oracle is incorporated around that time too.
Yeah, right? Well, Microsoft Word came out that year. So it's like all these major earth-shaking kind of innovations happened that just completely had, I would argue, a distorting effect on the culture.
The Tandy 2000, I think, comes out right around that same time too. The Radio Shack computer, if I'm not mistaken.
I thought that was earlier. Wasn't that like 81? I don't know. It doesn't matter. But
it's in that time period.
Yeah. It's just all these kind of things that sort of converge. But also, a lot of people don't remember that we had like 3 kind of serious Cold War scares, in some ways as bad as the Cuban Missile Crisis, but just have been kind of forgotten. The Soviet false alarm incident, I think that was in the spring. The shooting down of KAL 007 with Larry.
Oh yeah,
with
right.
Larry McDonald.
Larry McDonald. That's huge.
Yeah, September 1st.
And then who is it? Scoop Jackson dies the next day.
Oh, does he?
He dies the next day when he's talking about it, right? And he has a heart attack, giving this live presser, and then he dies. That happens the absolute next day.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me. And then Abel Archer in November.
I threw up 1983 here. Right there, January 1, the migration of the ARPANET to TCP/IP is officially completed. First day of the year, right?
Mm-hmm.
There it is. It's exactly
that's right.
It's exactly what you're talking about.
What I'm talking about, yeah.
Yeah. And if we wanted to scroll through this year, right, we have IBM releases the IBM PC XT, got a 3D printer, right? Things are happening here. Let's see, you've got an embassy bombing in Beirut, killing 63 people.
There was 2 bombings in Beirut. There was the Marine barracks bombing too. Nuclear shutdowns, the Challenger, which blew up in 86.
Right.
I think the HIV was identified. Yeah.
So you have Gallo and Montagnier, whatever that's about, right?
Yeah.
So that comes online in 83.
And another nuclear power scare in June 30th.
Right there in Argentina.
Yeah. Oh, and I should have made note of this. Nintendo's family computer goes on sale in Japan. So, this is really a lot of things are happening that would have a huge impact on our lives today.
Here's the Soviet nuclear false alarm, right? Where they were really close to pressing the button, right?
Mm-hmm.
September 26th.
And the same day you had the Soyuz explosion.
Right.
Fire. Yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely. Bang. Right there.
Oh, no, it was an explosion. That's right. So, yeah.
And then September 1st. So September is like huge, right?
Yeah.
There's Flight 007.
Yeah.
Wow,
I was a senior in high school that year. So
your head must have been spinning, right?
Yeah, it was. It sure was.
Here we go. Anything else interesting that year?
A lot of interesting things that year, but
So this is the year that broke reality, 1983.
Yeah, I think in retrospect, I think it really needs to be seen in that regard. We've had a lot of major years where a lot of major things happen. A lot of major innovations were introduced into the market. But I see this year as kind of determining everything that follows. And I always found it, really interesting that the first Stranger Things takes place. The story starts on November 6th, the day before Able Archer. So I think that there's a, really powerful sort of inference in there. I don't know how much of that is conscious on their part, but I still think that first Stranger Things is one of the greatest things ever made by anybody.
I think it's amazing. I think the first season is amazing.
Yeah, and I'll tell you something. For younger people, if you really want to get a taste of what that year was like, I am just shocked. I am just shocked. There's scenes in that I just feel like were just lifted straight from my experience, and I know a lot of other people my age felt the same way. So. Yeah. If you're a younger person and want to really get a sense of the kind of forces that were at work, obviously, maybe not the monsters running around to high school or whatever, but, if you really want to get a sense of what that year felt like, that is just absolutely uncanny to me. It can, my wife and I just did a rewatch before the fourth season started. And it's amazing how much different it is from the other seasons. And just how perfect it is. To me, it's just absolutely perfect. It
nails everything from it's a period piece. Everything is perfect. The kids are, kind of, these little outliers. They're perfect.
It's the attention to detail is so extensive that you don't even notice it. Talking about good comic book art, like the old school comic book guys like John Romita and John Buscema, their attitude was like, you shouldn't notice the art. If you notice the art, I failed at my job. What I mean? Right. It should be invisible, because you should be drawn into the story. And to me, that, the rendering and the attention to detail in the first Stranger Things is that same concept. I mean, I'm so drawn into the narrative that I don't think, I'm not noticing the gears turning. I can't see the mechanisms, and that's when art to me kind of transcends just entertainment and becomes something else.
Right, because you're not picking it apart and saying this doesn't fit, this doesn't work. So you're immersed in the experience. Yeah.
But even like, when things get to be too flashy, it's like one of the reasons why I certainly don't go see superhero movies anymore, because I just totally burnt myself out on that. Working on superheroes day and night kind of tends to cure you of any enthusiasm you have for the form. But, the CGI, I just find to be so incredibly distracting. I mean, even good CGI, I just find to be like really hard to watch. But, things that look great on the screen look just absolutely awful on television. And if you're not watching those movies, I think we're at the end of this. I've written a number of pieces for the blog about, we really are at the end of the superhero boom, and I think this year is kind of bearing that out. I said, we'll still have some big hits, but it's like everything else is just kind of shutting down, and I think it's for the best. I think that a lot of the sort of the negative influences on kids today that I think are like manifesting themselves in this like trans movement and
but don't you think that was a setup and a byproduct of stuff like the X-Men, that they were conditioning us for these mutants that were coming, and they were banding against the sort of this mainstream culture? Don't you think that was kind of
well, I think it's really hard to say, because this stuff has always been, these are essentially power fantasies for the powerless. I mean, that's how they started, and comic books were always, certainly from my time, were very marginal. I mean, most kids didn't read them. And I think, but when it came, when the CGI was the real game changer, when CGI became really extensive and really sophisticated, I think that these things sort of started feeding into it. And, when you talk about the X-Men movies, I mean, Bryan Singer,
Yeah.
What else needs to be said? I mean,
Right.
he was clearly using those films for, his own agenda.
Yeah.
And, clearly, I mean, we know about Bryan Singer now. We know who he is. We know he's a sex pest and a predator, and very talented guy. But
and he's still working, right? He's still working.
Is he? I mean, he might be working behind the scenes, but I think he's become a bit radioactive, because he was sort of, when all that stuff kicked up, he was working on the Freddie Mercury movie, the Bohemian Rhapsody film, and they kind of shunted him aside for that. So, I mean, it isn't just superheroes. I mean, it's Harry Potter. I think Harry Potter, is something that I've always been very skeptical about, that I've always had a real problem with, because I always saw Hogwarts, I always called it Sparta with wands. It just reminds me of, obviously the British public school system, the boarding school system, which is, predatory and exploitative. And
yeah. Joe Strummer talks about that. He talks about that in his film, one of the films that was done on him. And he talked about being in those schools. And he said, when I got there, I realized there were two groups. There's a group that either beat up on people or you were the beaten up on. So I decided to join the bullies because I didn't want to get beaten up.
Yeah.
I mean, right out of his mouth.
Yeah. It's, basically what they are is kind of like, just, like I said, it is like Sparta. It's a domesticated version of Sparta. I mean, how Sparta, the boys and the girls were separated from very early ages. And,
right. The boys are taken from their mothers too.
Yeah. The boys are taken from their mothers and put in this very harsh militaristic system. And, the boarding school system was kind of like a descendant of that. But it's a descendant of that way of thinking. But I always saw like Hogwarts is just like, I think that Harry Potter just really had a deleterious effect on the culture. And one of the, a number of reasons. One, it sort of created this idea of, the muggles and the magic, I mean, it's like this antagonism. It's already sort of a divide and rule concept. And also this idea of, going off to Hogwarts and, I mean, what would a real life Hogwarts be like? I mean, we know what it would be like because we have case histories to study. But when you add the magic and you add this whole fantasy, and the fantasy becomes so vivid and so, it's like just beyond your grasp, that I think that it drove like a generation of kids a little sideways. And the more sensitive or the more marginal kids who latched onto these fantasies, end up in things like Antifa and all this kind of stuff. They have this utopian ideal,
Yeah. Harry Potter is a millennial, it's a art form. Like it's a millennial touch point. The young millennials are taking Harry Potter in. Like this is what's happening. And in a lot of ways, it's emblematic of how I'm a big believer in certain movies connecting them with certain generations, especially like astrologically. Mm-hmm. So you're a Gen Xer, right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So your movie is Star Wars. That's your movie. Yeah. And it's because number one, you're coming of age with Star Wars. And number two, the relationship between Luke and Leia, it's all about broken marriages, missing parents, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
And Gen X has the highest divorce rate. Up to that point, right?
Or the parents have the highest.
Parents have the highest divorce rate. So Star Wars becomes the theme for Gen X in a lot of ways.
I agree with that completely.
Yeah, and each generation has their version of it. So I'm a little bit older than you. I was born in 1960, and
you're a Generation Jones, is what they call it.
I'm a Jones. I'm not a boomer. Thank you for noticing that. I appreciate it.
No, my wife's a Jones. She was born the same year as you, so.
Yeah. So our film was Mary Poppins, which is a version of Harry Potter, right?
Yeah,
Harry,
that's a good
Mary.
argument. Yeah.
Yes, and it's all magical, and astrologically, my generation is Pluto and Virgo, right? So what is she? She raises, she's a nanny.
Mm,
Who does she hang out with? The chimney sweep, right? They're both Virgoan characters, just doing everyday sort of things, right? And you're Pluto and Libra, so what do you have? You've got the relationship stuff, the light side, the dark side. Luke, come over to the dark side, right? So Harry Potter is the same for the millennials. It's the millennials kind of elixir, right? That's what they get dosed on, and it impacts them moving forward.
Yeah, but I also think it instilled like this expectation of like, we are magical, we have powers beyond mortal human beings. Not only Harry, but you said like
speak it into existence, right? Speak it into existence.
Yeah, I mean all the kind of stuff that the millennials were bombarded with from a very early age.
Yeah.
Like again, I think it just had a very corrosive effect because it instilled a set of expectations in them that are impossible, that are unfulfillable.
Right.
And you come to a certain age and a certain realization that I'm never going to become Harry Potter, and I'm never going to become Wolverine, or I'm never going to become Captain America or whatever, all these very rich and immersive fantasies, much more so than comic books. I mean, when you go into those theaters and you see those films, and it's just like you are living it. And when you're reading comic books, the action's taking place in your mind, and it's a more intimate relationship between yourself and the artist. Now it's very, the millennials are very group oriented. I would almost say mob oriented. But I think, that kind of Hogwarts Xavier Academy kind of thinking.
Right.
I think it crippled them, because the millennials, I don't want to bash millennials. I mean, my kids are millennials. I mean, they are all solid Gen Xers in spirit, right? I mean, if you met, I mean, they're very much.
But they have They have a collective intensity though, as a group.
Well, there is, and there's certainly. I mean, early millennials are much different than the later millennials.
Yeah.
But I think this whole idea of, this messianic sort of group identity that reminds me in a lot of ways of Childhood's End by Arthur C. Clarke.
Oh, I've talked about the millennials and Childhood's End.
Yeah.
Ad infinitum. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's
right. And what was Clarke? Yeah. It's interesting that a lot of these kind of stories are, feeding these kids with these sort of super being ideas is kind of classic pedo stuff. I mean, great example is Victor Salva with powder, right? I mean, you're familiar with that situation.
Yeah, absolutely.
But you also, there have been a lot of stories circulating. I mean, I don't know if they're anecdotal or if there's any proof, but that the kids who were cast in the Harry Potter movies a lot of them were sort of preyed upon,
compromised.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's just a very interesting dynamic. And again, I don't want to bash the millennials because we're all victims of circumstance in a way. We're all products of our time and our environment. But I think the fact that millennials are sort of the first generation to basically have created nothing, to basically have not contributed anything to the cultural conversation in any meaningful way. I don't think that's like some sort of inborn genetic, downfall. I think what it is, it's the culture. It's the way they were raised. It's being raised in a time of absolutely unprecedented prosperity, peace and prosperity. And, the 90s, which were the 90s were just a dream world.
Right.
And it's hard, especially after 9/11, when you face this much harsher world. But also, the computers and the social media, the sort of instantaneous, it's hard to create culture when everything is just under this withering spotlight. So again, it's like, I'm not blaming millennials.
And it's on demand too. I mean, that's the other thing about how this thing has evolved. Everything's just on demand, which is kind of like a cipher for magical powers, right? You hit this button and all of a sudden something happens and it becomes real in some ways. Right.
Yeah.
And I think that adds into their evolutionary process.
Yeah. But again, it's like, I'm not, and there are exceptions to every rule, of course, like the Duffer Brothers. I mean, I've always had questions about how involved they actually were in some of the specifics of the storylines, but they came up with this idea. But anyway, the point is that we are all subject, and as an astrologer, you certainly understand this. We're all subject to forces beyond our control and our reckoning. And I think that I hate to say things like this, but I'm just very pessimistic about how the system, as it was constructed by people who weren't raised that way, can survive, with this new thinking,
Right.
this more collective thinking, and these weird magical expectations that have been inculcated through corporate media. So this is what I'm saying. You need to prompt me because I start going off on these tangents.
No, it's a good tangent. I have some things to add to that, because as an astrologer, I look at Pluto defining generations.
Mm-hmm.
Millennials are born with Pluto and Scorpio. And what do we know about that? Like, Scorpio is about death. Scorpio is about transformation. And by the way, it's a sign that rules magic. So this would be a generation that would not only be predisposed towards the magical thinking of Harry Potter, but actually acting that out and finding like magical practices, for better or worse, to cohere to their mythology and their programming. And we go right back to Arthur C. Clarke and what is Childhood's End about? It's about this group of young people that literally destroy the world. They are world destroyers, right? And I think the millennials play a role in that, for better or worse. They are world destroyers. And we're looking at the end of culture, like the culture that we knew. You talked a little bit about this with
I think we're past that point. We've seen the end,
right?
In my estimation.
But they're like the kids. And again, I know a lot of millennials that are great. I'm not here to diss an entire group of people, but collectively, they're like that tribe of planetary kids at the end of Childhood's End that are basically vibrating the planet into non-existence, right? And that's their role. That is their role. Now, I think there's something beyond that. And the downside is we get to see this kind of unfolding nightmare in a lot of ways, right? And they're big numbers. Like, theoretically, the millennials are the second largest generation after the baby boomers. So we're talking about significant numbers.
Mm-hmm.
So we're seeing that. And I think you would agree that some of the culture does need to die. Like the stuff that you've talked about articulately about what was going on, like in Boston, or what was going on in China or Vietnam, Iran Contra, like this shit needs to go, right? So how do we exercise those demons and keep the better angels of our experience? I'm not sure we know the answer to that, but I think we're watching it now unfold.
Well, what I was talking about, I can't extrapolate my personal experience onto the wider culture, because not only is that like incredibly narcissistic, but it's just impossible.
Right.
I mean, but it's just like, one of the things that we have to understand, and again, as an astrologer, you understand this, is just like everything works in cycles. Things have beginnings, middles, and ends.
Yeah.
And I think clinging to the forms, to the dead forms, is like, it's like a never-ending Weekend at Bernie's experience. You're constantly clinging for dear life to things that are dead and just need to be buried. They need to be buried so they can be reborn. Or the parts of them can contribute to the rebirth. It's like, my mindset, I believe very heavily in reincarnation, and I just believe reincarnation is nature's way.
Do you want to come back?
Well, I mean, that's a whole other conversation. I'd written about, the basis of my belief in reincarnation in The Endless American Midnight. And it has to do with like personal experiences that almost seem kind of textbook.
I'm sorry, I threw you off track there a little bit.
No, it's all right. It's all right. So, but we need to let go of things. We need to let go, when somebody dies, we just, it's not like we just say, well, they never existed, or they should never have existed. It's like when people who we love die, we still hold them in our hearts. We hold our memories, photographs, things like that. I mean, we still cherish their memories. Letting them die is the way the world, the way nature operates. And I think it's the same way, with these other forces. It's just like cultures need to die so they can sort of act as compost for something to come next. And this is another thing that I think, is an important thing to raise as far as, the millennials never in creating anything, because they didn't have to, because everything was available to them.
On demand. It's an on-demand culture.
It's in perpetual, I mean, it's like it never goes, you have access to any number of, cultural artifacts and expressions dating back forever, whatever you want. So why would you be, motivated to create your own? For instance, so my experience in the hardcore scene, I mean, it's like, hardcore, I think, was not like a net positive in a lot of ways, because I think it sort of added a lot of like negative impulses into the culture.
It's pretty nihilistic.
Yeah, it was very violent. It was nihilistic. I think there were like sort of undesirable outgrowths of that, let's just say. But there was a very powerful impetus behind it. And the impetus behind it is that people my age, and people of my sort of inclination just didn't see ourselves in the culture. We didn't have anything that expressed our feelings, and a lot of our feelings were just like pure rage, and we had a lot of anger because, I was a latchkey kid. A lot of these kids were latchkey kids. You just grew up without the certainties, and you were very much aware that that these things were taken away from you, that the things that other, generations before you were taken for granted were taken away from you. Okay. So I think that really fired a lot of the sort of the just existential rage that you saw, and then that I still feel, I still listen to hardcore, I still listen to a lot. I mean, I listen to a lot of other kinds of music too, but I still listen to a lot of metal and hardcore and stuff, because it's like, it makes me feel good. It helps, if I'm feeling bad or depressed or have just some sort of negative emotions, and it's very therapeutic. And I think that's something that people tend to overlook. But we just didn't have anything. And what we also had is that we had like sort of our punk rock heroes who we sort of adopted as our own, either falling apart or selling out.
Right.
So you talk about Joe Strummer, it's just like, the Clash went from being basically the first hardcore band to doing like Rock the Casbah.
Right.
And like everybody I knew was just so disgusted by that.
And touring with The Who, right?
Yeah, and touring with The Who, exactly.
Yeah.
So it's just like, just watching all the, so everybody I knew who was into hardcore was into sort of like the late 70s punk and, some of the more energetic new wave stuff, right? And then, the 80s come and all these acts, the record companies say, your record's on selling, do this, do a disco song, do a soft rock song, whatever. And we just all felt like really betrayed and let down. Like we just felt like we didn't have representation, that we had adopted these acts almost as like our big brothers, and our big brothers all let us down. So a lot of the severe reductionism and puritanism of hardcore was just an extreme reaction to that. It's just like, well, we're going to make it so the record companies have no interest in us. You know, we're going to make it so we can't sell out, you know, and that became its own downfall. But, you know, so the point is, in a very roundabout fashion, what I'm talking about is like, that came to be out of necessity. You know, we couldn't get into the clubs. You know, we had no interest because all the old, you know, all the rock bands that were around, like say in the early 80s, were all mostly leftovers from the early 70s. And we're just really running on fumes creatively. I mean, I remember saying, this is a funny story. So I won tickets to see Ted Nugent at the Boston Garden in 1980. And I remember going there, and it was like, place was half full. And it was all like half full with like Beavis and Butthead clones, right? So it's really depressing. And the Boston Garden was just a dump anyway. And all Ted Nugent did the entire time was just swing back and forth like Tarzan on a rope while Derek St. Holmes sang all the songs. And it was just embarrassing. It was just, the whole thing was just a farce.
Right.
But you know, there were a lot of like people, you know, there's a huge crossover with the skateboarder community in hardcore. And a lot of skateboarders were really into Ted Nugent in the mid 70s and stuff. And, you know, it's just like, again, it's like things live and die.
But there was always something new in some ways to go to. Like there's that scene in 24-Hour Party People after they see the Sex Pistols. Mm-hmm. And they go back to Tony's buddy, and they're getting high, and he's ripping the posters off the wall. Right, the old rock gods are coming down off the wall, and he looks at Bowie's
Year
poster.
Zero.
He looks at Bowie's poster, and he goes, "Gotta go!" Right? It's like he even tears Bowie off the wall because there was this thing that was happening. And in order to go into that thing, you had to let go of the past, right? Which is what you're talking about. The challenge now is that there's no thing to go to, right?
No, it's all been exhausted. You know?
Yeah, you look out of the horizon, like what's out there? Well, it's already been done. Used to be made by a machine now. And if I want to listen to rock and roll, I really have to listen to amplified country music because rock's dead, right? So I think this is where we find ourselves. We're at this cultural cul-de-sac in a lot of ways.
Well, I mean, there are a lot of things going on. Like I've been on this like stoner metal kick, you know. I don't know if you're familiar with stoner metal, but it's basically, you know, a bunch of bands. They're like, boy, we really like those old Black Sabbath albums.
Right.
Let's sort of continue in that vein. And my joke is like stoner metal is like saying metal, you know.
Well, I remember
all metal is supposed to be stoner metal. What?
I remember versions of that from the early 2000s. Like there was kind of a thing going on.
Yeah, like Wolf Mother and some of those other.
But even Queens of the Stone Age kind of
Queens
like
of the Stone Age, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, they're sort of like one of the foundational bands.
Yeah.
But I mean, we are sort of at a point that things have been exhausted. But you know, there's also these macroeconomic factors. You know, it's like you could have music scenes in major cities and people could congregate and come together and
because really there's cheap living. There was cheap living there in the bad parts of town, right?
Exactly. Yes. I mean, you know, and even the bad parts of town are expensive now. I mean, I remember back in the 90s when I was working in advertising, you know, I was working at this advertising startup and it was on the Bowery. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? It was on this like part, it was right across the street from CBGB's. So it's just like, this is, you know, 20 years before that this was like a place you went to get stabbed. You know what I'm saying? So, I mean, it's just, you know, there are other forces. But, you know, as an astrologer, I mean, I have very much a sense that we are kind of at the end of a lot of roads right now. I think that,
absolutely.
You know, I think that we're at a lot of, so what happens, and you can explain the sort of the astrological underpinnings of this, is that at some point in time, everything just became fake. You know, the economy became fake, the culture became fake, our politics became fake, our media became fake. You know, everything is just false. Everything is a constructed narrative. Everything is a simulation. You know, and I'm trying to pinpoint exactly when that happened. Like, when did everything just become fake? But to me, that is like that's like what the French would call the fin de cycle, you know, that's the end of the cycle.
Right.
That where reality is replaced by the simulation.
For whatever you think about Kennedy, his death, real or not, I think it's the death of Kennedy. I think it's the birth of the Beatles. It's the rise of Tavistock culture. It's Johnson. Everything post Kennedy begins to take on this plastic effect. I mean, even the Beatles are singing about Rubber Soul, right?
Yeah, no, but to me, like, I think it's, I don't know, I think it's sometime in the post 9/11 period, because I mean, I understand exactly what you're saying, that that's when like the national security state really starts to take hold of everything. You know, it just becomes this behemoth that just lords over all aspects of culture and politics.
Right.
But you know, we still had real things happening. You know, I mean, we still had, you know, say like, so we had the riots in the late 60s, and, you know, we had these, you know, these radical movements, you know, a lot of obviously were intelligence creations, right. But, you know, you had, I don't know, it seems like the metaphor I'm looking for is that we went from the world of atoms to the world of electrons. You know, we went to the world of atoms, of things moving, you know, of metal and wood and wire and just things happening, blood and flesh, and to this pure kind of projection.
It's a digital world. It's the 0 and 1 world. I think that's what you're honing in on. And post 9/11, I mean, let's look at 9/11 for a minute. Like how many versions of what happened on 9/11 are out there? You know, how many versions of no planes, planes, right? Now we're in this kind of occultic world of replacing imagery. Like, I think 9/11 is huge and more important than people understand from a geopolitical perspective and from an occult perspective. It's massive. We're not the same after 9/11.
Yeah, well, I mean, so I did this presentation for my Patreon, and I don't know if you're familiar with the work I've done, what people call astrotheology. I don't like that term because I don't like the connotations behind it, because to me, it seems like very kind of 90s Usenet skeptic movement stuff.
Right.
It's just this, you know.
Yeah, I think it's a loaded term. It's a loaded term.
Yeah, but so I can maybe send you a link to the presentation. I'd done a presentation down in Cancun for this Astronosis conference, and I showed the specific astrological or astronomical symbolism at work in 9/11, because I mean, you're familiar with so where the ecliptic meets the galactic plane just above Orion, right? I mean, what do you have? You have the twins, and then you have the Pentagon, the Pentagon of Auriga, right? So you have the twins of Gemini, and then you have the Auriga, which is a Pentagon. So it's like, if you get rid of those, then you can ascend to Cepheus, which is the garden, which is God, which so I see this all as very tied into like Watcher worship and Nephilim worship, which I think is the kind of the true basis of a lot of elite belief systems. And it's something that I've been, you know, following for a number of years now. But I think that it's much more an underpinning, you know, this idea of, you know, the Watcher Angels are the good ones because they brought technology. I mean, you know, that's the story that we have, and we have a number of different iterations of that, you know, in the Book of the Watchers and the Book of Jubilees and Enoch and so on. So it's just like, all right, so the Watcher Angels were the ones, you know, those are the good guys, you know, they're the ones who came to teach us how to do all this stuff and everything like that. And we have this whole history of like these almost like trickster gods who are also, you know, civilizational gods. And a lot of them come from the abyss, you know, Osiris, Oannes, right? Associated with the oceans and everything. And, you know, you know all the stories where the galactic plane below the ecliptic is associated with the abyss and the waters and the deep and so on.
Right.
So, I mean, that's how I see 9/11, is that it's, and I sort of detail it, how I see it as very much a watcher ritual. And it's interesting to me too, because we have the Chamber Street subway station right near World Trade Center. We have all the eyes, you know, it's called the Oculus. And then you have the Oculus, where World Trade Center now is the Oculus. And it's like, it looks, you know, you could see it as like angels rising from the deep, you know, from the subway, right?
Right.
The subway. Okay. Just think about that for a minute.
Right.
So, I mean,
we're the DOMs, you're the subs.
Yeah. So, you know, it's interesting too, because, you know, one thing that people who are familiar with my work, I mean, I was working in Lower Manhattan at that time. And as a matter of fact, in the month of August, like I was in that neighborhood pretty much every day.
I was there too. Not every day, but I was in the subway station in August.
Yeah. So you know exactly what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Because I was working for this place called MediaWorks on Lexington. It was Lexington, right? No, Lafayette, on Lafayette Street. So I was in through there, and then I had a buddy of mine who lived on South End Avenue, and we were working on a film treatment together. So like that's where I'd be on the weekend. So I'd take the ferry in from Hoboken into World Trade Center. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. But it's just like I see, you know, that astronaut, and this is something you and I should discuss off air, is, you know, I'd like you to have a look at a lot of the symbolism.
Yeah, I'd love to, because there's a ton of Gemini symbolism in the mundane chart for that moment. The moon was in Gemini, Saturn was in Gemini. You're dealing with the twins, and it gets into the main characters, the main players of 9/11, like Larry Silverstein, who's a Gemini, Rudy Giuliani's a Gemini, Donald Trump is a Gemini.
Oh, man.
It goes all the way back. It goes back to the 60s, where JFK was a Gemini. George H.W. Bush is a Gemini, right?
Oh,
all that moves forward to 9/11, right? You're dealing with the Twin Towers. So from a mundane perspective, these are other pieces that fit your astrotheological construct. It's all there. It's all there. And then they're going to create one tower to rule all, right? They're going to eliminate this idea of duality, but we're going to run the reality that comes after duality. And
yeah, I think that, yeah, that's very true. And it's like, you know, I see Nimrod in the Tower of Babel, you know, so they put up that tower.
Which looks like a giant hypodermic needle, by the way.
Yeah, but it's also, if you look at it closely, I mean, this is one of the things I talk about. It also has Cepheus kind of encoded into it.
Yeah.
And I can show you that, because it has sort of like the square base and then the.
Yeah, you know, I would love to take a look at that and maybe have you back on my Sunday night show, which is just, you know, based on astrology, and we could just dive into that thing. I'd love to do that. Yeah,
I'll send you the link to the video. But anyhow, okay. Yeah, see, this is me going off on tangents. Like
no, it's a good tangent. I'm a tangent guy. Let's keep going, because I'll tell you where I want to go.
But also, let me just tell you, I just want to tell you one last thing. So the Astronosis conference was put on by Miguel Connor. Do you know Miguel?
No.
Miguel Connor does Aeon Byte, Gnostic Radio.
Oh, I'm familiar with that. Yeah.
Yeah. So he had a very interesting theory, and one of his theories was that you know, 9/11 in a lot of ways was an assault on Generation X. So Generation X was, you know, I mean, the oldest Xer at that time was 36, right? Old enough to become president, right? And, you know, we've had this phenomenon where the boomers just continue to cling to power, you know, when most normal generations would have long retired, right?
Right.
So, you know, he saw that, and you'd have to ask him for the specifics, but he saw that as like an attack on the rise of Gen X. And Gen X, you know, it's interesting that they've since been, you know, or we've been sort of written out of history. You know,
well, which is
like we don't exist anymore.
Well, it's a shame, because it's a really interesting generation. I've looked at this astrologically. The outer planets for Gen X are basically Pluto and Libra, which I like, Neptune and Sagittarius, which is exalted and filled with mysticism and wisdom. And then you have Uranus in either Sagittarius or Scorpio, and Uranus and Scorpio is exalted, and it's all about, evolution, right? So as a generation, Gen X with the outer planets is wired to do really interesting things, more so than some other generations, in my opinion. And maybe this is at the root of that.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly possible. Again, it's not my theory, so I can't really go into the specifics of it. But
Right.
So there you go.
So okay, here's where I wanted to go with ultimately, and we kind of got there through 9/11. 2 days ago, we had the quote unquote destruction of the Georgia Guidestones. Okay.
Yes. What
What is your take on this? There's a lot of different takes going on, but it kind of gets into the 9/11 world because it happens on George W. Bush's birthday, who's overseeing 9/11. Right. So there's a lot of really, and I think it was erected on 3/22/1980. And now we get into Skull and Bones and then George Bush again.
Yes.
Okay. Why don't we start there? And you have the stage here and just, run with this thing for a while.
Well, one of the things that I always found interesting about the Georgia Guidestones is that, this whole Rosicrucian connection. So a lot of people who are stupid sort of see like, they subscribe to the sort of like left-right binary or this occult Christian binary, like that these people are all like set in these categories that, they're like a rabbit on a track at a dog race. They can't get off. It's like you're set in that for life. And if you really look at history, you understand that things are much murkier, particularly at an elite level. Okay. When you get an elite level, things start to, get very strange, and there are a lot of strange bedfellows. So there is this kind of like post-theosophical, post-Rosicrucian mindset that you saw obviously involved in the creation of the United Nations, right? Because we know about Robert Mueller and Alice Bailey and all these kind of things. So the Georgia Guidestones seem to me like, because there's the eugenics, and then they've traced it to this guy who sort of was a David Duke supporter and all these kind of things. So it's like things start to get very murky when you get above, the plebes. When you get above the plebe level, things get weird.
Yeah.
And so there's this fascinating discourse that took place where, you sort of like team left or team blue on Twitter was like, this is like, what was that woman, that candidate from Georgia said they should be blown up. And there's all this kind of like, everything has to, the millennials are horrible with this, but everything has to be injected into this whole dichotomy, this whole fake dichotomy that nobody above the plebe level subscribes to. Okay, absolutely nobody. So that's what I see, sort of like this idea that's like, so it's like this right-wing guy, but he's talking about world government and world courts and a world language, this kind of stuff that we associate with the people came to associate with the left, that really comes from Alice Bailey. And Alice Bailey was like, she's saying that, the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were like, exalted by the Great White Brotherhood, and they were, a symbol. She had some pretty extreme ideas.
Well,
that
so
most
she
people would identify as extreme right wing.
She was a nobody until she hooked up with Foster Bailey, who was a 33rd degree Mason. I mean, she was kind of considered this, kind of well-meaning but not very successful kind of medium in Southern California, who would hang out at esoteric bookstores. And she marries this guy, Foster Bailey, who's a 33rd degree Mason. And all of a sudden he's going like this. I got something on my hands here.
Yeah, I think that was all an operation. I think it was a British intelligence operation. I'm not exactly sure what the office would be at that point in time, but I think that it was all, I think that the Lucis Trust and Alice Bailey were just basically operations, intelligence operations. And I go into this because I don't know if you're familiar with this, but I've talked a lot about how the Cthulhu mythos that H.P. Lovecraft wrote about really comes straight from Alice Bailey's books. She's put forth, the Atlanteans. I mean, she uses slightly different terminology, but she uses a lot of the same terminology, like the old ones and the great ones and everything like that. So, if you look at like Lovecraft's history, he seems to have very strange friends. The most extreme example would be Houdini, right? British intelligence agent, but also this guy named E. Hoffman Price, who clearly to me was Army intelligence, and was feeding. He was the guy who was feeding Lovecraft all this theosophical stuff, like the Book of Dazan and everything like that. So this all does tie back to the Georgia Guidestones, but it's like there's this level that's very much tied into intelligence, but also some of these elite. You'd mentioned Tavistock and anything like that. That has views that some people have come to associate with the quote unquote left, but also other views that people have come to associate with the extreme right. Okay.
Like eugenics. Eugenics is baked in there as well. And that's kind of extreme right? Right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I see the Georgia Guidestones as very much an outgrowth of this, this Alice Bailey level, post-theosophy level, sort of the quasi-New Age level. But there was a lot of overlap, not only with right-wing politics, but extreme right politics, like the silver shirts and so on.
The guy that funded it was, I think, influenced by William Shockley.
Well, I think he was friends with Shockley.
I think he was friends with Shockley.
But Shockley, there's a transistor for you.
Right.
And, that's Lucifer's Technologies, the transistor, which just sort of pops up out of nowhere, and there's, people say, oh, there's precursors and everything, but I actually went back and I read the patent applications, and there was no workable, feasible precursor to the transistor, or even anything that we would recognize as such. It really just did pop out of nowhere. But that's, again, a whole other conversation. So back to the Guidestones. I mean, my gut sort of tells me that it was an inside job, that it was time for it to come down. Like it served its purpose and it was time to go. And it's like when I look at the trade towers, there are any number of stories, all these things that we'd see in media, 9/11 or the towers coming down or anything like that. And it's just like those towers were built to be destroyed.
Absolutely.
And in my estimation. And then there's a lot of Masonic stuff where like 2001, September 1st, 2001 is like in the Coptic calendar, the ancient Egyptian calendars, it's the first of the year. It's the new year of the year 1717, if you follow the Coptic calendar. So 1717, I don't think I need to explain that to you, right? So there's a lot of things, but my feeling is that it was time to come down, and maybe it was time to come down because it's like this layer that I talk about, this lucis layer, this strange connection that you have between sort of like a lot of these UN groups and like at the Rockefeller level and so on. But this, this agenda, this eugenics agenda, this depopulation agenda, obviously, coinciding with George W. Bush's birthday, obviously, it feels. I mean, they might find some patsy to take the fall for it, but it feels to me like it was an inside job, that it was time for those things to come down, and. This follows, my thinking about ritual, that so many of the things that we see in history, a lot of major events and stuff that we can't understand only make sense when you put them in a ritual context. When you plug them into ritual context and when you understand the traditions that they're drawing on, then they explain themselves. Right. They really do. They really do explain themselves. There's so many things, and I've talked about this at excruciating length on the blog, that a lot of things that we don't understand in public kind of events and so on make perfect sense if you understand the ritual
The
elements
ritual
behind
context. Yeah. Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You said something in the Higher Side Chats interview that you did recently that I wanted to comment on, which I thought was interesting, and it's a stark contrast to, like, say, the high sorcery of these rituals. And I agree with you with what you said, by the way, because Greg brought up the WF and Klaus Schwab, and I was watching some of those videotaped interviews with people at Davos, and I'm like, pardon my language here, these people are fucking idiots.
They really are.
They're like idiots. So you have this whole cast of characters who are average at best, right? And they're the ones that are sent out to do the dirty work, the everyday work, pass the memos, send out the emails, coordinate on the messaging. But they're in stark contrast with this other level that seems to be above them, that is engaged in this kind of ritualistic sort of administration of reality. So where are you with that? And what do you think is going to happen to what they used to call these useful dupes or useful idiots?
A lot of times they don't have happy endings. And it almost seems like there's a kind of sadism on the part of their handlers to humiliate them on the way down. We've seen this a lot throughout history. People who serve the system and are no longer useful are kind of discarded. I just want to, so when you talk about that level above, like, say, like a Schwab level,
or maybe even above Schwab. I'm not even sure about Schwab's credentials either. I mean, clearly he's got some.
Yeah. I mean, but who could it be? It's like, one of the things I thought was really interesting at Davos was like Henry Kissinger being the voice of reason on Ukraine. Like Henry Kissinger, nobody would call a peacenik, saying it's time for the Ukrainians to sue for peace, or otherwise their country will just be utterly destroyed. And that was like shocking to me. I mean, my sense is that, if there is a layer above, say, the Schwab layer, there's certainly nothing like what that layer used to be, because we've been living in a time of unprecedented comfort and security and prosperity, and that softens people.
Yeah.
It used to be, when we talk about the private schools, and it's like, the war was won on the fields of Eton, that old expression that the British had. Where if you were going to go into a higher, some sort of leadership role in service of the empire, you were expected to go out and fight wars. You're expected to go out and experience privation and horror and hardship, because that toughened you. Right. That was the crucible. That was that, remember that old ad, the Marines, when they're hammering the sword, and it's like, this is going to toughen you up and everything like that. Yeah. So it's just like, I mean, who could they be? Who could they be at this point in time? Because a lot of these, so there's this whole idea of these hereditary families, but it's pretty well documented that fortunes are kind of won and lost within 3 generations, and it's very difficult to maintain generational wealth because of
the softness, right? You get down to that 3rd generation, and they're like, "Hey, we just want to enjoy the fruits of the land here," right? I mean, that's what happens. So
yeah, you don't want to go out and fight in the trenches somewhere. So, I don't know who that layer could be.
Right.
I just don't. I don't. And, it almost seems to me like the sort of endless goalpost move. When we discover, we watch Davos and we realize these people are all idiots, which they are. Yeah. They're all functionaries. And one thing that I've come to see is I see, the demon is the system itself. That the demon is self-perpetuating. The demon has its own, the system has its own intelligence. The system has its own drive and will and goals. The system is the egregore, right? The system is the construct. The system is the sorcerer's apprentice that becomes the master and takes on its own agenda. because what again, like what you see is that these people are all just imbeciles. And, I'm not saying that to like cast aspersions. I mean, it's just these people are just objectively not that intelligent. They're certainly not geniuses. One of the things I've been doing a lot on Twitter, because it drives me nuts, is that anytime, what is that guy, Yuval Noah Harari,
right?
Or something, I'm just like, because he's always talking like all these futuristic proclamations. And I say, this guy's a historian. He's not a scientist. He has no engineering or computer science background. He has absolutely these are just his opinions. They're no different than your or my opinions. They're no more informed than your opinions or mine. He just has this megaphone that's given to him by the WEF.
And everybody just nods
the shit
their
he
head.
says is stupid.
Everybody just nods their head. Oh, wow. That's brilliant. That's genius. Oh, I see where the future is. Nobody ever questions his sanity. That's the other part.
Yeah, the sanity.
The sanity part.
And in Elon Musk, saying we're going to Mars next year. I mean, he's been saying that for God knows how long. When nobody's ever going to Mars, ever. Nobody's ever going to Mars, ever. It's just not. It's never going to happen. And my expression is nobody's going anywhere. No one's going anywhere, because it's like, whatever your views are, like globe Earth, flat Earth, whatever, I'm not even going to talk about that. I'm just saying, just based on the science that we've been presented with, you cannot go and build a base on the moon because there's no water there. Or, that's what scientists tell us, there's no water there. Who is going to sit in a tin can for 3 months to get to Mars? Nobody. It's just not going to happen. It's just like, and what are you going to do when you get there? You know what I mean? There's nothing there. There's nothing for us outside the biosphere. There really isn't. All we have is here, and everything outside it is just death. Okay. And that's just if you go by standard issue kind of commercial corporate science. I mean, even by their own standards, there's nowhere to go to. It's like, oh, we're going to go mine asteroids for precious minerals. No, you're not. That's never going to happen. You're not going to do that. It's just like the logistics of that are impossible. How are you going to get all this prefabricated habitat metal, all these, the tubes and the wires and the panels and the struts and, all this kind of thing that you need to build a habitat on the moon? How are you going to get it up there? It's just never going to happen. I really believe that the space program, I've really come to believe that space programs are just basically ways of getting around like these old missile testing treaties. I think what they're really testing is like ICBMs and so on. And just this whole idea of like spacecraft is just ludicrous. I just think it's really ludicrous. And believe me, I used to believe all that stuff. But why did I believe all that stuff? Because of media in Hollywood, because
comic books.
And comic books, it's like I would go see a movie like, I don't know, Star Wars or 2001 or Star Trek. And I was like, that was my conditioning. And I just realized it's all fake. None of that is ever going to happen. It's just never going to happen. I know some people get angry at me, and I'm just like, no, it's impossible. It just cannot be done. And, if you listen to my appearances on Greg, I mean, it's like, I'm very pessimistic about the future of just the technology that we already have, because technology is not self-sustaining. Technology does not run itself. No matter how many bullshit stories we hear about artificial intelligence, these machines don't run themselves. They all have to be maintained by very highly skilled people. And in the case of the infrastructure, it has to be, guys with a lot of the high T count, you know what I'm saying? It's like guys with a lot of balls, it's like getting up on these, high tension towers, or, even just like telephone poles, or, never mind on top, these transmitters on the top of these skyscrapers and everything like that. I mean, that's scary work. I could never do that.
Absolutely.
I have a friend who worked for Verizon. He's retired now. He's my age, but he's one of these guys who would get up in the cherry pickers during storms and fix the wiring. Who's going to do that now? And this is what I'm talking about. It's just like,
well, that gets down into a whole discussion about basic skills. I mean,
well, that's exactly
yeah,
what I'm talking about. Just like
yeah,
we had this weird, I would say almost suicidal inclination that like blue collar work, learning trades, fixing the phone lines, doing all this stuff was like, that was like for the, the deltas, that was just
right.
like, that was monkey work, right? Anybody could do that, which is a lie. And it's not as important as these people just like shuffling papers around on Wall Street, or these people just talking bullshit on MSNBC. Like those are the exalted ones. Those
Right.
people are nothing. Okay. The
Yeah.
people and you can see this on Twitter, like all these media people are just in this constant state of meltdown because they realize that anybody can do what they do. They really can. I mean, and you talk about Davos, none of those people are particularly intelligent. I mean, they are well educated,
But there's not an original thought in their brain.
Nothing.
Yeah. It's
because original thought is punished. Original thought is actively discouraged.
Right.
And a lot of what the woke shit is about.
Rewarded, right? They reward you for, basically spouting kind of a refabricated version of the party line, whether it's, social theory or critical theory. You're rewarded for that.
Yes. So, we are at the end of the globalization program, which started really I would say in the first Bush, George H.W. Bush.
Yes,
That's when we started hearing this phrase, international community. So I'd listen to NPR, like All Things Considered. And it's like, well, the international community said this. And it's like, who the fuck are the international community? Like, who are you talking? Like, who are you referring to? Who is this body that is called the international community that you reach out to for an opinion on, the news of the day? I mean, it's just like, it was really corporatism run amok, and a lot of kids are very down on capitalism, but they don't understand that what they're really down on is corporatism, corporate capitalism. And globalism, put simply, is corporate capitalism unfettered. Corporate capitalism with the reins off, with the gloves off too. And the rest of the world is tired of it. The rest of the world is sick of it. And, I hear a lot of people saying, oh, this is all just part of this overarching plan and everything is just kind of an act and everything. And yeah, well, there's always the outside possibility that's true. But I just find that hard to swallow in this day and age when we don't have, say back in the first Bush administration, we had a very tight control on the conversation. There were just a small number of outlets for news and information.
Right. And Sunday mornings, you got the Capitol Hill gang, right? Like,
yeah.
More
telling you what to think.
And all these guys.
If you're left, the McLaughlin group. If you're left,
Yeah.
Believe what Eleanor Cliff said. If you're right, believe what Pat Buchanan says. Yeah, exactly.
I was on a flight one time with Bob Novak.
Oh, was he? Yeah.
I was coming back from Mexico, and he was on the same flight from LA to the Bay Area.
Yeah.
And
was he being a curmudgeon?
Well, so Clinton had just beaten Bush.
Yeah.
And he was on the sidewalk waiting for a car or something, right? And I'm out there with him, and I walked him. I said, "So, what about that New World Order?" And he said, "It's over. New World Order's over."
Certainly, I think that fares with it, but it's like the capitalist, corporatist.
Yeah.
And I just prefer the term corporatist because I think it's more accurate. So the corporatist world order kind of arose from those ashes. And, that whole line of thinking that we saw in the Guidestones, kind of was the underpinning of that.
Yeah.
And again, it's like people just don't understand that like ideology is for the plebes. The people at that level are just looking at spreadsheets all day. I always point people, it's almost 50 years old now, but it's as relevant as ever, that the Ned Beatty speech in Network.
Oh yeah.
You know what I mean? Because that I mean, it's a work of genius, you know,
Yeah.
and it's like, that was before, Wall Street and the Pentagon took hold of Hollywood and I guess put a stop to all that kind of thing. But that is, that's like when you get a peek behind the curtain, because the truths, that's how they think. That's really how they think.
Well, Anthony Sutton got into this in a big way when he went down his rabbit hole and got into the whole relationship of power. And he got there going through Skull and Bones. He said they don't care what side they're on, right?
No.
They don't care if they're on the left or the right. They're just into power, and they'll move it. They'll move the needle any way they want to, whenever it suits their purposes to achieve a certain goal. That's
so you and I are older, right?
Yeah.
Like I guess I've lived long enough to see everything that I thought the left stood for become what today, the fake blue Twitter left is against, or the things that the left were supposed to be against, the left now is for, the corporatist left.
It's weird because there was so
surveillance,
yeah.
I mean, all the stuff. I mean,
right.
And if you were a leftist, you were supposed to be for free speech. You're supposed to be against war. You're supposed to be, against surveillance and the CIA.
There was even a kind of a conspiratorial side with the left. Like they would go and like break down COINTELPRO and all that stuff. Right.
Yeah,
now
exactly.
they don't even want to look at it. It's like, no, we don't want to go there.
No, because it's not the left anymore. They're just now the lapdogs, the purse puppies of the national security state.
Right.
And everything they believe has been dictated to them, and they don't question it. They don't test it. They don't question it. I mean, if Antifa was for real and not just some sort of weird COINTELPRO project, they'd be going after the banks. They wouldn't be like burning down some local coffee shop. They'd be, finding where the Vanguard and BlackRock offices are in their town. And
right. They'd figure out where Jamie Dimon lives, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Very
so I mean,
fake,
it's all, but that's what I'm talking about. Everything is fake now. Everything is a hoax. Everything is a production. And I think that, I mean, I would have to do more specific study on this, but I think this is just a feature of late imperial
decline
cultures and decline. Yeah. I mean, it reminds me of, like the court, what was it, of Louis XVI, before the revolution, and they just created this sort of walled garden, this little fantasy world that had nothing to do with the world that was going on outside the walls. Right. And I think that, the present power structure is trying to do that now. But listen, I mean, power structures fall, elites fall, even at the highest level, elites fall, are taken out, taken down. I know a lot of people sort of sort of cut their teeth on a lot of this sort of leftover 80s and 90s conspiracy stuff, like Fritz Springmeier or something, where these like 13 families and, like of the Illuminati and everything like that. And it's just like, come on, I think that's just, I think that's a flight from reality, because I think in many ways, the real reality is more frightening, and, it's more pervasive, but it's also more nebulous. It's, it's harder to pin a target on, but the present elites are going to fall within our lifetime. They are. I would argue that they're in the
I think they're in the process of falling. I would agree.
Yeah. So it's just like, these things take time, they're not sudden. I mean, just look at, there's a line of thinking that I subscribe to, that there wasn't two world wars. There was one world war with an interregnum. Right. You know what I mean? Like with an armistice.
Right.
But it was all just the same players and the same processes working themselves out. And what did that take? I mean, that took more than 30 years, right?
Right.
And then I mean, I really honestly believe that we're at the end of the ruling structure as we knew it in the West. And in a lot of ways, they have no one to blame but themselves. But in a lot of ways, it's just inevitable. It's just inevitable. You're an astrologer, so you understand cycles. I mean, astrology really ultimately is about cycles.
Yeah.
It's the cycles of time, that things repeat themselves. and there are certain ways that we can understand how they repeat themselves and when they repeat themselves. And you just understand that things just rise and fall and always have and always will. And it's just, we cannot define nature. And this is another thing that I think is a hallmark of imperial decline, is this idea that you can define nature. And I think the impetus behind that is realizing that nature is not on your side. You know what I mean? It's like nature turns on you because it's time for you to go.
Right.
And then you start to defy it, and you start to create this fantasy world. Like I said, with, the court of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette and all the rest of it,
Right.
we kind of see, versions of that, but also this flight from reality with, like, the trans movement, quote unquote trans movement, because, listen, I have sympathy for people who honestly have gender dysphoria. I really do. I think it's a real condition. I just don't think it's anywhere near the scale that we're seeing it at today. I think this is a cult.
Yeah.
But there are any number of cults. But it's just like, look at what's happening. Big tech is starting to experience layoffs. I mean, all these big companies have lost, a lot of them.
The legacy media companies too.
Legacy media, but
really going down.
Facebook has lost half of their market cap in the past year. Netflix has lost 70%. Disney has lost, I think, almost 50%. Is continuing to lose market cap. Those are the numbers that they care about. You know what I'm saying? And there's this whole woke contagion, which is another one of these flight from reality cults that is, that they see as a way to fend off, the hoi polloi, right? To keep the pitchfork brigades from their gates, but that's not working either. And it's, you cannot define nature. It's like the wise emperor, realizes when it's time to leave the world stage. But unfortunately, all we have now are idiots with no wisdom,
Right. We're coming up on 2 hours here, and that's usually about how long I go. So a couple more questions I wanted to ask before we tapped out today. Actually, one thing I wanted to bring up, then a question I wanted to ask you. So one of the things that I looked at was the change in fixed star Regulus going from Leo to Virgo. And that happened back in 2011.
All right.
And a day later is when Occupy Wall Street happens.
Mm-hmm.
So you have this fixed star Regulus in Leo, which is associated with kings and queens and the hero's
journey. Regulus,
right. The hero's journey, right? The hero's journey in Leo. We're born and bred into that context. Like, life is a quest. You find yourself along the way. And if you're good enough and brave enough, you get the Holy Grail, right? That's part of our mythos. And then it changes and it goes into Virgo, which is a very different sign. And it's not about that. It's more about the barista, right? Or the everyday person. And then almost to the day Occupy Wall Street happens. And now we have this new movement, which I think dovetails into what you're talking about with this anti-capitalist thing, which really should be anti-corporatist. But this also gets back to what you were saying earlier about Harry Potter, is that, if the people from Hogwarts need power, then they have to abide by the sorcerers who give them the power, right? And so so what we're dealing with now is corporate sorcery. And the corporation or corporatism has become the Hogwarts, which is why they have an allegiance to it, because they derive some kind of power. Because the corporation said, screw profit, right? We're going to go into the whole stakeholders world and we're going to make sure it's about people, not profits. But what are they really saying? We're going to empower these people, and theoretically, they're going to get the magical powers from us so they can take the old world order down. Which brings us back to childhood's end.
Yeah, well, so Arthur C. Clarke was very much a product of the British intelligence establishment. He was very much in with those people. He was part of military intelligence. Okay. And he was also, a sex pest.
Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, that's like, the whole idea of childhood, just the title "Childhood's End" is a little, it's a little bit
It's
of
a loaded title.
yeah, a little bit of double entendre there.
Yeah.
I think, so if you look at the late stage of the British Empire, they had the wisdom to realize that they could not run a boots on the ground empire anymore. The playing field had been leveled in a lot of ways, and they could no longer sustain this, right? So they became a corporate empire, which they are today, and they're still an extremely powerful corporate empire. I don't think people really understand that. In the same way, so people will look at the church attendance, say at Catholic Mass and say, well, the Catholic Church is clearly on the wane, not realizing that the Catholic Church's real business is real estate.
Right.
They're one of the largest holders of real estate in the world, as is the
Queen.
British Crown, the
Right.
Queen of England.
Yeah.
So these have both become virtual empires in a way. They don't need the people streaming into the pews, because in a lot of ways that was a liability, because people needed to be, a lot of times needed charity and needed to be fed, and needed a lot of attention. It was expensive to sort of maintain this physical empire. And that's so, but the thing is that virtual to me means fake.
Right.
So it's just like these empires became fake. And I think we're sort of on that, we're on that road ourselves. The American empire in many ways is an outgrowth of the British Empire, obviously. But so we're just at that end. And like I said, I think it's a very common inclination, understandable inclination, to not want to accept these realities, to not want to, accept the fact that the ride's almost over. And I think that there's a lot of cope that comes with that. And I think this whole, like what we're seeing with DEI, which is diversity, equity, and inclusion, that, Vanguard and
Right.
State Street and BlackRock and Blackstone and all these
Right.
big capital funds are pushing.
The Death Stars.
Yeah, but it's just like, so, but the thing I always point out is that DEI means God in Latin. So it's
Right.
like, this is their new God,
Right.
but it's a false God that nobody believes in. And, that church is collapsing. So, I mean, a lot of what we've been seeing and what we saw for the past 20 years in the post 9/11 period, particularly, I think that really rose into its own during the Obama administration, which was just, to me, entirely, everything was fake about it. Everything from soup to nuts. It was
Right.
it was like the fake hoax.
He's even the genesis story of Obama's.
Yeah, I mean, everything about
fake.
it is utterly fake. But it was all being powered along by free money, interest-free money. But also, if you listen to my appearance on Greg, I want to talk about like money laundering.
Yeah.
I think that people don't understand how important money laundering is to the larger economy, the macro economy. And a lot of that was drug money. Okay. A lot of that was drug money.
Going through Silicon Valley.
Yeah.
Right.
And, and it fed Hollywood and it fed Silicon Valley and it fed Wall Street. But, all good things must come to an end. And, we're seeing the end of that. We're seeing the end of the large scale money laundering. But a lot of that money is also being pulled back. So like China, this whole phenomenon of the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Now, but a number of other countries are sort of signing on to this program, this new alliance. So a lot of that money is just being pulled back into their own economies. Like I'm not an economist. I'm just talking about sort of like these macro movements. I can't explain the mechanisms behind it, but I'm just seeing what's happening. And like the money tide is going out. The money tide is going out.
Yeah.
And what was feeding so much, for instance, the Hollywood blockbuster was being fed by money laundering. These movies didn't really actually cost $200 million. It's like what they call Hollywood accounting, because they had to account for all this laundered money. And that's something you can go out and read about. This is something that's documented. This is not just opinion. So the money tide is going out, but at the same time the money tide is going out, it's like that the global vassals are tired of being, on the shit end of the stick. And we're going to see this, this is why we're going to have like these supply chain disruptions. And it's also, I mean, don't get me wrong, it's going to be a lot of manipulation, a lot of, bad actors,
Right.
imposing themselves on these larger realities and exploiting them and exploiting us. I mean, that's definitely, we're all in for a rough ride. We're all in for choppy waters. I'm not saying anything differently. I've never said anything differently. But I think that at the end of this process, there is at least the opportunity for a more balanced system, not where like CEOs are making 100,000 times, their average salary workers, like what we have now, these absurd, obviously not 100,000 times, but, these ludicrous kind of
significant.
Yeah. These ludicrous inequities.
Or even the valuation of a company like Netflix, which does not turn a profit.
Never has.
Yeah. And yet it has been propped up by Wall Street because, well, we're looking at future valuation.
But also social engineering too.
Yeah.
I mean, the media, all these ideas, see, this is what I'm talking about. These people are not all knowing by any stretch of the imagination. In a lot of cases, they're not even smart. And a lot of these ideas that they subscribe to were just basically pipe dreams, pipe dreams that were sort of dreamt up in City of London smoking rooms 100 years ago. Right. I mean, in a lot of ways, these ideas are insane. Yeah. A lot of these programs that they're working very hard to inflict on the rest of us are insane. They're insane ideas, but they cannot let go of this fantasy, this utopian fantasy, which is, to me, it's almost like a drug. And it's certainly a religion, it's certainly a cult, but they cannot let go of it. They're going to have to let go of it the hard way. And a lot of us, are going to suffer during this process.
Don't you think there's also like a crash and burn policy here? Like if it's going to go down, then it's going to go down for everybody. If it's going to go down for us, it's going to go down for everybody.
Yeah, I think that I'm like always like an all of the above kind of guy.
Yeah.
I don't believe in these kind of like, oh, there's this one plan that everybody subscribes to, even if they seem like they're not subscribed to, and even if they're actively working against this plan, they're secretly on the side because that's all part of this big, show that they're putting on for us. And that to me is like, that's very Hollywood thinking. And to me, it's almost like Saturday morning cartoon thinking. A lot of people have a lot of different interests and they have a lot of different bailiwicks that they're trying to protect. And a lot of things are going on at the same time. And I think that's part of our problem. That's part of the problem. The world has just gotten too complex. There are too many things going on, and there are too many redundant systems. There are too many systems that were put into place for some short-term payoff that were just grandfathered in to the larger system. You understand what I'm saying?
Sure, absolutely.
So it's like, Schwab I understand the impetus behind the Great Reset. I understand like the thinking behind it. Like, it's just like, okay, we've always had like this accumulation, this accretion of all these things that rose up in the greater economy over the past, in the post-war period, over the past 70 years, that just have outlived their usefulness or never really useful to begin with, or become sort of parasitic or whatever. There's a lot of reasons to reset, or I use the term reboot, like to reboot.
Right.
A lot of these systems, they're in need of it because they are no longer functional. They are no longer helpful. And it's just basically people's salaries, like the salaries of mediocre functionaries rely on the sustaining, I'm sorry, like after 2 hours, I think my mouth stops working, that are reliant on, the train running.
Right.
The train staying on the
tracks.
They'll
do everything they can to keep it moving forward because they don't want to sacrifice their salary, their 2-week vacation, in the Maldives or whatever, right? I mean,
yes, exactly. So,
Yeah.
so if we had people who weren't insane, like Klaus Schwab and Yuval Noah Harari and just all the rest of these people, who are, I would say, objectively, it's insane. Like they
yes,
say
they
insane
absolutely.
things. They
They
say
do. They
they
do.
say
No,
things that are just like that you would imagine, even just 20 years ago, a lunatic saying.
yeah.
So they say things that are insane. So it's just like the wrong people are in charge of this process. But maybe that's also an inevitable part of late stage empire. I don't know. But to me, it's like that's like sort of like the setting, but it's like my interests, are more personal and on a more personal level. Like how do you survive within this system? How do you
Right.
survive within this process?
Right. So you're a Cancer astrologically, right?
Mm-hmm.
You just had a birthday.
That's
So
right.
that's a very personal sign, right? That's a very personal sign. Cancers are concerned with, personal issues, growing security, right? The family, right? It's localized, it's organic. So that's kind of an outgrowth of your astrological designation in some ways. I mean, that's not the totality of who you are, obviously, but it plays a role in there. This leads into my question, and we're going to let you go here so you can get back to your world. So you're a Cancer, which means that your sun is likely conjunct Sirius. Is that the secret sun that you're talking about? Is Sirius the secret sun?
No.
Okay.
A lot of people assume that.
Okay. That's why I asked you the question.
All right. So my sun is in Cancer, my moon is in Cancer, and my ascendant is Sagittarius.
Okay.
My ascendant sign. And I don't know what any of that means. I just know that it means something.
You know where they are.
Yeah. No, so the secret sun comes from dreams that I had starting when I was a little kid, that the sun would be out in the middle of the night. But it was like a different sun. It didn't look like the sun does right now. It looked different. The lighting was different. Like shadows were different, everything like that.
Right.
So, and it was usually between the time of 1 and 3 a.m. that the secret sun would come out. And like there would be certain like people walking around who knew that the secret sun was out, but a lot of people didn't. And then it sort of came to incorporate like marshes, that marshes were sort of important. And, marshes are liminal spaces, it's like between the earth and water, right?
Right.
But it also came to incorporate this weird motif of like a suburban neighborhoods, like on the sort of the rim somewhere, like hidden somewhere on Manhattan Island, that
right.
You'd be walking, the brownstones and the townhouses or whatever, skyscrapers, and all of a sudden there would be this like very idyllic suburban neighborhood that the secret sun would shine on, let's just say. So, I mean, I've kind of worked on this, my entire life, trying to figure out what exactly, and there were a lot of layers of meaning, but the secret sun is just basically the sun that comes out in the middle of the night, looks different. Most people don't know about it, and has these connotations to these liminal spaces. So I guess you would say that it's like a very liminal idea. It's about boundaries sort of morphing. It's about things changing, but only certain people understand that they are.
Right.
Let's just say.
Right.
I mean, I don't know. Any number of people are always disappointed when I tell them that.
No. I think it's a cool story. If we had time, I could probably link that up to your chart, but we're not going to do that right now. So hopefully we'll get you on my Sunday night show, and we could talk more about your presentation, because that sounds really interesting.
Oh, I'd love to do that. Yeah, I think you'll be really fascinated in the work. So one of the things that, the focus of the work in many ways, and I see this as the focus of a lot of these traditions that I look at, particularly esoteric traditions, is the royal arch. So where the galactic plane meets the ecliptic at, Gemini, and, just above Orion, and at galactic center. Okay. So, above that you have, Aquila and Lyra and Cygnus. And then, we get into like the Perseus constellations, but
Right.
sort of at the top of that heap is Cepheus, the gardener. But Cepheus is sort of like in this conflict with Draco around the pole star, right? And the pole star, to me, in the biblical story, is the pole star is actually the forbidden fruit. And I can sort of walk you through how like the pole star is the forbidden fruit, because Adam and Eve are Perseus and Cassiopeia, okay? And, God, the garden, Cepheus, the gardener, obviously. And, it's all about, ascending to heaven. But to me, the esoteric things, like in this sort of underground Freemasonic constellation, no pun intended, but it's about restoring the Watchers to the garden. So the Watchers are beneath the ecliptics. They're in the underworld. They're in the abyss. You know what I mean? They're in Tartarus.
Right.
And that's all that loop, you know what I mean? Where we have Puppis and on the other side we have Lupus and then Lepus. We have Lupus and Lepus.
It's the uppuses. It's the yusses, right?
Yeah, all the yusses.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
So
the yusses versus the thems.
So, so we understand that all this mythology was, it was all above the equator, right? It's all north. Right. These are all northern constellations that were of utmost importance. Because people, people writing these stories were all above the equator, right?
Right.
So, but they could see certain, like, Orion and everything. And Orion is, the headless right. I mean, again, I can go on forever here and go on all sorts of tangents, but it's once you understand that is the goal, is to restore the Watcher Angels to the garden and through the gates of Boaz and Jachin, aka right. Castor and Pollux, right?
Yeah.
And that the vehicle that takes you up is the charioteer, the Pentagon, Auriga,
right?
Which is, it's both the charioteer and the goats, the kids. So I mean, it's a whole thing.
The goat tail from where was he? Was he in Georgia or someplace like that when he told the goat tail? What school? No, it was Florida. Florida.
My pet goat.
Yeah.
There you go. So there you go. I've got.
Yeah, that's crazy. That takes us back to the Chicago Cubs and the.
Well,
and the goat story and
my pet goat, I believe, is Capella,
right?
Auriga, and I believe that Capella is associated with Solomon. So that would be Solomon's temple, because Auriga is very clearly associated with King David. Because if you look at depictions of King David and also Christ the Good Shepherd, so Auriga is not only the charioteer, but he's also the Good Shepherd, right? With the kids, you can see him holding the stirrup or the whip, and then the kids. And then you see that same imagery with King David, where he's holding the staff and the lambs, and the same thing with Christ. So it's all the same symbolism, and it all sort of, it's all about like rising to the top, rising to the North Pole,
to the pole
of heaven, and the pole star. But, Draco is there sort of circling around,
guarding it,
always trying to undo your best efforts and so on.
Right.
So,
that's great stuff.
It's really very simple when you just understand that basic theme.
Right.
So many of the things that people have kind of puzzled over for thousands, literally thousands of years.
It all opens up.
It's just like, oh, that's what it is. So, I mean, I think there's a very heavy ritual aspect to this.
Right.
And I'm not like one of these astrotheologists who's just like, oh, it's just that, they just saw these little dots in the sky and they told these little stories about it.
Right.
I think there are, much more profound meanings behind it, and also profound rituals behind it. But we can get into that another time.
Let's do it. Let's have you back on a Sunday night. And before we go today, let's tell people about where they can find your extraordinary work. You have your blog, and I have it up here somewhere. Where did we go? Why don't we start here? Let's go to Amazon. Is there another place you can send people for your books, or is Amazon a good place?
Yeah, they're as good a place as any. Unfortunately,
Right.
there's a monopoly.
Let's throw this up here. And Endless American Night, Our Gods Wear Spandex, The Secret History of Rock and Roll. Is that the Trinity for now? Are you working on something else?
Don't forget He Will Live Up in the Sky.
Oh, you live up in the sky. Oh, He Will Live Up in the Sky. There we go. So there's a quadrinity.
Yeah, that's a novel.
Okay. So you could get all three there for $66.18. That's a great deal.
Yeah.
Right.
Interesting numerology there too, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Are you trying to tell me something?
Yeah, we got our eyes on you. The watchers are watching you.
Yes. Yeah.
So let's get your blog up here, which is The Secret Sun. Right there. This is the latest that you did with Greg over the Higher Side Chats. Secret History of Rock and Roll. So if you want to find out more about Christoper and his work, you can come on over here, going all the way back to 2007. Look at that. You do some deep mining there. I love this. Dog.
Yeah.
That basically says it all right there. Hey, thank you for coming on the show. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I really did enjoy it. Enjoy it.
Yeah, good stuff.
I'd really love to talk about the star stuff.
Yeah, let's get you on my Sunday night show. We'll like just open a portal and you can just, be the water bearer and pour the contents right into that show. That'd be awesome. So enjoy your weekend.
Thank you.
And great talking with you. We'll see you again sometime, okay?
Awesome.
Thanks a lot, Christoper.
Thank you.
All right, bye for now. That was Christoper Knowles with from the Secret Sun blog. Boy, what a great show. Am I right? And looking forward to having him back on Sunday night. So I get to take care of an order or two business now. If you're interested in attending the event in October with David Palmer, the Leo King, and we'll get into more astrology that weekend and a bunch of other stuff. I have a link over here on robertphoenix.com that can get you there. Well, get you there in terms of being able to sign up for it. Let me just go over here for a second. I gotta get into the website, not in the admin. Give me 1 sec. So I can show you the page. You can get to it via my homepage. It's not occulted. It's not hidden. So here we go. As you can tell, I'm not in my normal hill country locale, which is why it looks a little bit different today. Anyway, there you go, robertphoenix.com. Click on that right here, the details, and it will take you right to everything you need to know about what we're going to be doing in October. Hill Country Harvest Moon. There's David. We've got some cool things lined up for some extracurricular activities. And of course, David, being a electronic music wizard, is also going to supply us with some frequencies, tones, and beats that weekend as well. So you don't want to miss out on that. And then, of course, my website, robertphoenix.com. If you're interested in getting an astrological reading, you can do that there as well. And that page is right here. And I specialize in a lot of stuff, including relocation, couples work, believe it or not. I'm really good with couples. And by the way, you get a reading, watch this video. It has instructions on what to do afterwards. You can call me, right? You call me, and that's how you set everything up. And I know some of you sent me emails, and I will get back to them. I promise you. I think that's about it. That's the order of the day. Thanks again to my guest, Christoper Knowles from The Secret Sun. And you guys take care. Use your head in order to discern what's real, your heart to say up when it's possible. I'm